Fitness has become an obsession for a lot of people in our society. And one source claims that Americans spent over $25 billion on health clubs in 2015. 25 billion. And of course, that's not all the money going toward that, right? I mean, we could add to that all the money people spend on home exercise gear and athletic apparel and nutritional supplements. I mean, you could just keep adding. Who knows how many billions of dollars that includes. And then, people, of course, invest lots of time, countless hours in working out. And yet, I think there's an important thing to recognize. Physical strength or fitness is always just a means to an end. There's always something beyond that. There's always something that somebody wants out of it. I mean, really, you get down to it, whether you exercise or not, or whether you think that's just all a bunch of foolishness, we all crave a sense of power and stability and control. However you get there, we all want it, right? And so we pursue it in different ways. And most of those, quite honestly, they don't work. They leave us disappointed. Now, today we come to Judges chapter 16. And I think there the Bible captures, in the story of Samson, this pursuit of strength, of control. Now, of course, Samson was one of the judges. That was one of the informal leaders of Israel during that time period before they had a king. And Samson led for 20 years in Israel. We learned last week from our study of Judges 14 through 15 that he was blessed with not only supernatural physical strength, but also several other gifts and abilities. And so God wanted him to deliver Israel from the Philistines. They were a nation that was over along the west of Israel, along the shore of the Mediterranean. But what we saw last time was that Samson was squandering his abilities really on selfish things, selfish goals, not really using them for the Lord. So though he was the strongest man in the world physically, the conclusion of his story here in Judges 16, I think it demonstrates 5 competing paths to gain strength or to gain that control, that feeling that I have power. Right? Physical strength wasn't enough for him. And all of these fail except for one. We'll get there. But as we read through the chapter, I want to encourage you to think about your own life. Think about the ways, how is it that you pursue strength? How is it that you try to maintain this sense of control? We don't have to go down all the paths that Samson did. We don't have to make the same mistakes, right? His story helps us find the one true path. So the first path that comes out in Judges 16 is the path of reputation. Fame has never seemed more accessible than it does today in our world of smartphones and social media, right? When a picture or video clip goes viral, it can be seen by millions of people. Right? Someone anywhere in the world can all of a sudden become this superstar, this celebrity, just because of some silly little video clip, right? Some cute picture or something. Now that desire to be known, to be famous, to be appreciated, or even to be feared, that's not anything new, right? That's always been around. That's part of human nature. And people have gone to incredible lengths to cultivate a reputation for themselves and to gain the sense of power that comes along with that. Judges 16, as it begins in verses 1 through 3, it records Samson's effort to bolster his reputation. Take a look. Here's what it says. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. And the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Now, what's behind all this? What's going on here? The motivation behind Samson's little immoral escapade here, it's about more than sexual desire. We need to see that, okay? Gaza, this city, was located at least 35 miles from Samson's hometown. And not only that, Gaza was like the capital of the Philistines. It's in the heart of Philistine territory. And so if this was just about lust, Samson would have had easier ways to fulfill his lust than going to Gaza. Okay, so he goes into enemy territory, right into this walled city, and just kind of brazenly saunters in and has this affair. And then as he leaves, he rips off the gates. Now, this is not like your garden gate, right? They didn't have chain link fences or anything. Scholars estimate that these doors that he's carrying had to have weighed at least 5,000 pounds, maybe up to 10,000. And so he takes them, it says, to Hebron. And you go, okay, well, Hebron was around 40 miles away from there. So he hefts this massive gate, carries it 40 miles, sets it up on top of a mountain outside of Hebron. Why? Well, you remember we read in the last chapter about how the people of Judah turned Samson over to the Philistines, right? Hebron was like the capital of Judah. And so here he is, and he's putting up this sign. All of this is about showing off. He's showing that he can do this, right? He can walk right into the middle of Philistine territory. He can rip the gates off of their main city and carry them over. And he's boasting, right? I mean, he's not verbally, but at least by his actions. So why? What's the deal here? Well, I mean, in some sense, you might, if there was any good explanation, we might call it psychological warfare. Certainly, he's intimidating the Philistines by doing this, right? But he doesn't follow up on it. It's not like it's the prelude to a battle. He doesn't lead the Israelites into military action after this. And plus, I mean, he could have intimidated them by just going in and ripping off the gates. He didn't have to go in and commit sexual sin. See, he wasn't fulfilling his divinely ordained mission. He was just bolstering his reputation. He's just showing off. Now, of course, none of us have that kind of ability, right? We don't have his physical strength. But aren't we all tempted to brag? Aren't we all tempted to show off in some way? Right? We do it with our knowledge, we do it with our abilities, we do it with our accomplishments, we do it with our possessions. Anything like that can become a source of personal pride that we try to use to gain something. Right? To gain this reputation, this notoriety. Now, the book of Proverbs, of course, Samson didn't have this, but it was written after his time. But Proverbs 16, verse 8 warns us and says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Proverbs likes to draw out the natural consequences of things. And on a natural level, even just apart from God, on a natural level, when we get caught up in trying to impress people, it often has the opposite effect, right? People realize what we're doing. It makes us look immature when we're trying to show off. Plus, when we show off, what does it do? It kind of invites people to compete with us and to criticize us. So even just on a purely natural level, pride, a haughty spirit goes before a fall. But even worse, pride sets us on a collision course with God. I mean, the truth about the Lord is that he deserves all glory, all honor, all praise. And when we're trying to steal that for ourselves, then we're competing with him. The book of James points that out. James 4, verse 6 says, about the Lord. He gives more grace. Therefore, it says God, catch this, opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. You see, that path of reputation, of showing off, of pride, it's not going to work out the way that you think it will. Right? It doesn't lead to control. It doesn't lead to power. It never works. Now, the next path that we come to in this chapter is the path of money. Now, people often point out all the things that money cannot buy, right? Things like you can't buy love, it can't buy happiness, it can't buy integrity. And so that's true. We know that there are limitations to money, but when someone lives on the edge of poverty, when you're at the point that the slightest problem can become a major crisis, the paycheck's late or an unexpected bill, when something like that can throw life into turmoil and chaos. I mean, it may not be about pursuing extravagant wealth, but we do have this tendency to rely upon money for our strength and stability. Right? Jesus teaches us to pray, to give us our daily bread. But most of us don't even have to think about that because we have a full fridge or a full pantry. And so even without realizing it sometimes, I think we base our strength on the money that we have. Now, the book of Judges doesn't say that Samson pursued money as a path to strength. He didn't go down that route. But that whole pursuit still plays a really significant part in the story. Take a look at verses 4 through 6 in Judges 16. It says, after this, he, that's Samson, loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. Now, there's a lot of questions about Delilah that we just don't have good answers for. So it mentions that she lives in the valley of Sorek. So that's very close to Samson's hometown. But the text doesn't tell us whether she was a Philistine or not. It would seem like it. Some people have speculated that she might have been an Israelite, or perhaps she was of some other nation. We just don't know for sure. Now, because of Samson's involvement in the previous passage we read with a prostitute, some people say, well, Delilah was a prostitute. But it doesn't say that either. Right? She's obviously having this immoral relationship with Samson, but it doesn't specifically say that she was a prostitute. So as we continue through the story, what we do see is she does seem to have a home. She has a house. It seems to be big enough to have multiple rooms. And it seems to be that she lives alone, probably. So we could speculate maybe she was a widow, maybe she inherited the home from her parents. We don't know. But I think there's perhaps the possibility that she knew what it was to struggle financially. And so whatever her situation was, the lords of the Philistines come to her here. And they take advantage of money as their pathway to power, right? To gain control, to use Delilah and to gain control over Samson. Now, these were probably the rulers from each of there were 5 kind of key cities in the territory of the Philistines. Gaza was one of them that we just talked about. And so each of these rulers offer her 1,100 pieces of silver. Right? Now, one commentator estimates that much silver, 5,500 pieces, would be like the equivalent today of maybe $50 million. I mean, this is an incredible fortune they're offering this woman. Now, even the most principled person, I think, would be tempted to go along with that. Sell out Samson for $15 million? Of course, we know the problem with money is that it can easily take the place of God in our lives, right? Think about it. We work for it. We rely upon it. We define ourselves by it. Sometimes we look to our money for comfort, right? We go out and spend it to kind of make ourselves feel better. Therapeutic shopping and that sort of thing. Jesus warned us about money in Matthew 6:24. It says, "No one can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Right? There is this tension that money can play. It definitely can take the place of God in our lives. I like the description of money. I think the proper view is captured in the Proverbs in chapter 30, verses 8 and 9. It says, "Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God." Isn't that good? Just enough, Lord. Give me just enough. Is that your perspective? Or has money become something more to you? You know, is it edging God out of your life in some way? Money can't give us the strength or the security or the control that we need. There's another path. The third one in our story here today is the path of love. You know, if you experience a sudden change in your eyesight, it's obvious. You know there's a problem, right? If all of a sudden things are dark or there's spots or something, you know. But when it comes to love, right, the overwhelming emotions of love can blind you, and you don't even realize what's happening. There can be glaring problems in a relationship. Everyone else sees them, but you don't. In fact, you resent the fact that anyone would question the relationship because those emotions become so powerful, so addictive, this sense of strength, this security that's bound up in those feelings. Now, at its best case scenario, those emotions translate into the lifelong commitment of marriage, grounded in a true commitment to the Lord. Right? That's the ideal. But at its worst, those kind of emotions, that love blindness, opens you up for betrayal and heartbreak. And that's what we see here with Samson. Samson experienced this betrayal to some degree earlier on when he tried to marry the Philistine woman back in chapter 14. Right? Remember at the wedding feast, Samson made a bet with 30 Philistine men that they couldn't solve his riddle. Remember that? We talked about it last week. And of course, in the name of love, his wife persuaded him to tell her the answer to the riddle. And then she went and revealed it to the Philistine men. And of course, that created a whole mess there. Now, in that story, the interesting part is she talks about love, but it never says specifically that Samson loved her. It just says that she looked good in his eyes. So now we come back to chapter 16 here. Here, Samson's love for Delilah, it does mention that. We just read it in the passage a moment ago. He was passionately in love with this woman. Now he, again, ignores God's design. He plunges ahead into a relationship with her, a sexual relationship, despite the fact that they weren't married. And he should have been suspicious, right? When she begins to ask, how can we take away your strength? Duh, come on, Samson, wake up, right? But he's blinded to it. He just goes along with it. He should have realized she was taking advantage of him. And he does resist at first, but that doesn't last long. Take a look. Beginning in verse 7 down through verse 16. It says, Samson said to her, "Well, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." And so, of course, it says, then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in her inner chamber. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. So apparently the men didn't reveal themselves, the men who were in hiding, right? They're just testing it to see. So then, next verse. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you've mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Same scenario. Next verse. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web. And she made them tight with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, here it is, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And it says, when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. Right? He's completely blinded by his love for her. And he just keeps going along with this. How gullible is that? Now, again, looking at the Proverbs, Solomon warned his son about that danger, about the way that love blinds us. In Proverbs 7, he told the story of, he calls it a simple young man who's enticed by an immoral woman. And verses 21 and 22 there say, with much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast. Right now, Solomon there was speaking to his son. We could say the exact same thing about a young woman, right? With being seduced by an immoral man. Right? Love has that effect. It can blind us. And so when it comes to relationship, we need to heed the words of Proverbs 14, verses 15 through 16. Now, this isn't speaking specifically about love, but I think it applies well. It says, the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. One who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. It doesn't seem like the most romantic thing to be prudent, to be cautious when entering a relationship. But we should be cautious about love. We should seek advice from godly people in our lives, because when they raise concerns, we shouldn't be so quick to brush them aside, because we need to remember that the emotions of love can blind us. Even in a healthy relationship, we can't expect a person to be our strength. Right? There's no perfect person. There's no person who's without sin. There's no person who won't disappoint us. That's not reality. So this pathway to love, even though it has all the emotions and feelings, it doesn't give us the strength, the control, that secure feeling that we're looking for. So there's a fourth path that comes out in the story. It's the path of religion. You know, when we see a magic show, we know that we're being tricked, right? I mean, we know that magicians use distraction and sleight of hand to create an illusion. They don't actually have the power to bend the laws of nature. But Many people, I think today and throughout history, when they come to religion, they tend to think that religion has that kind of power. They want control over some part of their lives, and they assume that if I just do this religious thing, that then I'll get what I want. Like having a magic charm or something, right? If I pray, if I go through this ceremony, if I participate in this ritual, then I'll get something back from God, as if there's this magical exchange. Well, here in Judges 16, Samson assumes that his hair has magical power. Take a look at verse 17. Here's how he finally responds to Delilah. It says, he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. See, for him, his hair was like this magical amulet. And as you read verses 18 through 19, it seems to confirm this explanation. Take a look. It says, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up again, for he's told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands, and she made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. So at that point we would think, it's true. His hair was magical. But keep reading. There's an very important footnote in verse 20. Here it says, she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as other times and shake myself free. And then here it is. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. See, I think the point of that note there is that Samson's hair did not have magical power. The Lord was the source of his strength. So you have to understand that. It was God. It wasn't his hair. And despite all of his foolish, sinful behavior, the Lord continued to strengthen him. Right? He was supposed to be he was supposed to be faithful to his Nazirite vow. But as we talked about last time, he really wasn't. The hair was kind of meaningless. The whole idea of the hair was supposed to show that you were being holy and separated and focused on the Lord. And he wasn't doing that. But when he here then attributes his power and strength to his hair, that's the last straw. Then the Lord leaves him. See, I suspect that they didn't even need to cut his hair at this point. I don't think it was the hair at all. It was the Lord. But this explanation, this kind of magical, mystical explanation of his hair being powerful, that fit really well with the Philistine view of the world. Because they view his defeat as a gift from their God Dagon. And so take a look at verses 21 through 24. It tells us, sadly, the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. And they bound him with bronze shackles. I'm sure there was probably some magical significance to that they were bronze. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who's killed many of us. See, they couldn't imagine, and I'm sure most people, even among the Israelites, couldn't imagine, that the true God was still working out his unstoppable purpose, even through Samson's humiliation and all that was inflicted upon him. I mean, whether it be the idolatry of the Philistines or Samson's mystical reliance upon his hair, the fact of the matter is that the true God is offended when someone views religion and ritual as a path to power and control. See, God, that's central to understanding God. When we look back at the Ten Commandments, remember the first two of the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20? It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." That's the first commandment. And then the second, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Why? Verse 5, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." See, idolatry was all about trying to manipulate God. It was about trying to control a deity, to get him to do what you want. Right? You have a statue and you give it a sacrifice and you expect that your crops are going to be blessed because of it. Now, we don't make physical idols. But don't we take religion, things like going to church, prayer, doing good things, and we have this mindset sometimes that we can bargain, that if I do this, then I'll get God to do what I want. So we're falling into the same trap that we're talking about here, using religion as a way to control God. See, that's the spirit of idolatry. That's at its core what idolatry was. And when we treat God that way, it provokes him to jealousy, like the passage says. Because that's not who he is. He deserves to be loved and obeyed and served just because he's God. Not to be used like some little magic formula. So religion, if that's our mindset even in coming to church, it doesn't work. Right? It doesn't give us power. It doesn't give us control. And so we come to one final path, and this is the true one. The fifth path is faith. The lowest point on the surface of the earth is along the shore of the Dead Sea. It's over 1,400 feet below sea level. And so for centuries, waters flowed into the sea and evaporated, leaving behind salts and minerals. As a result, the Dead Sea is 9 times saltier than the ocean. So there are no plants. You can't survive there. There's no fish. It's empty. It's dead, like its name says. And when you're there, the only way to go is up, right? Because it's so low. Well, to understand faith, and really the essence of what faith is, we have to reach a point like that, like the Dead Sea, spiritually. See, we need to reach a point that we have no other choice but to look up and to see that apart from God, we're dead, that we're empty. Now, Samson's hair was growing back. We just read that. Right? But he hadn't regained his strength. That's important to grasp here. It wasn't like all of a sudden he had this supernatural power as soon as his hair grew back. Why? Because the hair wasn't the source of the power. They were still making him grind. His hair was growing. It was obvious in their minds that they had beaten him. They had broken the magic over him. So they thought. And so they blinded him. They made him do these menial tasks, all to humiliate him. Now, really the lowest point of his humility comes in verses 25 through 27. Take a look. It says, when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. So this must have been a massive temple, a massive building. And here you think Samson could not have been more humiliated. This was the lowest point in his life. Everything was taken away, his eyes were blinded, and now he's having to, who knows, dance or sing or whatever for the people that were torturing him. And here's where Samson finally comes to the place that his heart opens up to the Lord. That he relates to God in the right way, right? Because he was completely desperate. He looks up and he cries out to God. Look at verse 28. We'll read down to verse 31, the end of the chapter. It says, "And Samson called to the Lord and said, 'Oh, Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes.' And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other. And Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And then he bowed with all his strength. And the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years." Now it's interesting here. When you think about it, God's trying to save Israel from the oppression of the Philistines, right? And how does he do it here? He does it through Samson being humbled and humiliated. There's a parallel there with Jesus, isn't there? Right? We're not oppressed by a physical enemy, we're oppressed by sin, facing judgment. And so how does God rescue us? He sends his son to be humiliated and to die, to rescue us. It's an interesting comparison to make. Now, of course, there's also some huge differences between Samson and Jesus, right? I mean, Samson's focus on vengeance here suggests that he still didn't really see himself as serving God's purpose like Jesus did. He was, Samson wasn't focused on delivering Israel. That wasn't what he had in mind here, even though that was his purpose. That's why God gave him strength. His request was still self-serving. But what we see here is that his attitude changed. He was humble. He was reverent toward God. He hadn't been that way before. We saw how he prayed at the end of chapter 15, and it wasn't like this. He uses God's name, the Lord, right? In Hebrew, that's Yahweh. He refers to God. So there's this sense of humility and sincerity here. And he finally acknowledges that it wasn't his hair that gave him strength. He's praying for God to give him strength. So despite his foolish past, and all the sins, and all the misunderstanding, and all the craziness, he trusted here in the Lord. He exercised genuine faith. And God delights to work through faith. God loves to bring about strength and salvation when we say that we can't do it on our own and we have no other choice but to rely on him. And so here, that meant defeating the Philistines. But think about that in your life. Have you ever reached that point where you've just realized, where you've said, I cannot do this. I cannot find the strength that I need, the security, any sense of lasting security on my own. Or you realize I'm sinful, I'm helpless before God. It's when we're at that low point, when we're willing to acknowledge and to genuinely be desperate, that's when we begin to truly rely upon God, to truly trust and have faith. I love in Psalm 73, the author expresses this attitude. He's talking about his struggles with envying the wicked. And he gets to the end of the psalm in verses 25 through 26, and he says this, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." See, the irony is that the only path to spiritual strength is the path of weakness. It's coming to that place of humble faith in God. So which path are you on? Where are you looking for strength and security? Trying to build a reputation? Is it through money? Is it love? Is it religion? Is that even why you're here this morning, trying to work a deal with God? Or is it this faith, this desperate faith that says, I don't have anything else. It's all you, God. If you've never done so, I want to encourage you to trust in God alone. I mean, you don't have to reach that place like Samson did of being humiliated to turn to God. Right? You can choose to recognize those things without going through that kind of experience. So I'd encourage you, trust in Him. Rely upon Him. I think Psalm 73 is a great resource to look at in working through that decision. You may not be ready to make that choice, but maybe set aside some time to at least read, to consider what the psalm has to say. If you're trusting in God and you're trying to keep that focus on Him and not turn aside to those other paths, and maybe that verse we just read from Psalm 73 would be helpful to you, to commit that to memory, to think of saying to God, You, Lord, you're the strength of my heart and my portion. Or maybe the Lord's bringing to mind somebody in your life who needs to trust God, who needs some encouragement to trust God, some help. Maybe they're heading down one of those other paths, and they need that word of encouragement, of advice, maybe even of warning. If that's the case, make a commitment to pray for that person. Pray for them, share some truth, encourage them. May God help us to rely fully upon Him.